6 months after Derek Palmer called me worthless in front of the entire executive team, I walked into the boardroom as his new boss. The look on his face when I personally handed him his termination letter was worth every million I spent to buy the company he thought he'd built. The champagne flowed freely around the mahogany conference table as Derek Palmer and his executive team celebrated another record-breaking quarter. I sat quietly in the corner, taking detailed notes as the Senior Financial Analyst. My ideas had driven that growth, but Derek would never acknowledge it. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to welcome you to Success Reversals. If you enjoy stories about underestimated people who rise to claim their true worth, please consider subscribing. It helps us bring more of these powerful narratives to light. The boardroom of Meridian Technologies exuded wealth and privilege. Italian leather chairs, a view of the city skyline from the 37th floor, and executives in bespoke suits congratulating themselves on achievements they hardly understood. Chief among them was Derek Palmer, the 42-year-old CEO who had taken over the tech consulting firm 3 years ago after the founder's retirement. Q3 revenue up 18%, Derek announced, loosening his custom-made tie. Client acquisition exceeding projections by 22%. He paused dramatically, letting his gaze sweep across his leadership team, and market penetration in the healthcare sector double what our competitors achieved. The statistics were accurate, but the credit was misplaced. The healthcare sector expansion had been my strategy, presented in a memo Derek had initially dismissed, before implementing it word for word 2 weeks later as his vision. And let's not forget to thank our diligent note-taker, Derek suddenly announced, gesturing toward me with his champagne flute. Though I have to wonder why we keep you on payroll when my teenage daughter's smartphone could probably do your job better. Laughter rippled around the table. Mark from sales nearly choked on his drink. Vanessa from marketing covered her mouth but couldn't hide her smile. Even HR Director Philip, who should have known better, joined the collective mockery. I forced a polite smile while continuing to document every word, every figure, every dismissive comment. At 34, I had spent 7 years at Meridian, watching my innovations fuel the company's growth while my career remained stagnant. Derek had passed me over for promotion 3 times, each time selecting someone from his inner circle despite my superior qualifications. Seriously though, Rachel, Derek continued, emboldened by his team's response. We're cutting departmental budgets next quarter. Maybe it's time to consider whether your position is essential. More laughter. I maintained my composure, nodding, slightly as if acknowledging constructive feedback rather than a public humiliation. My apparent meekness only encouraged him. I mean, what exactly would we lose? He turned to his colleagues, enjoying his moment. Has anyone ever actually read those reports she compiles? What Derek and his smirking executives didn't know was that those detailed notes weren't just for their meeting minutes. They were evidence for the investment group I secretly controlled, Horizon Capital Partners, which had been quietly purchasing company shares for the past 2 years. Horizon Capital Partners was my creation, funded by the 8-figure settlement from my previous employer, after I won a landmark intellectual property case. The company had tried to claim ownership of a software algorithm I'd developed on my own time. After a grueling 2-year legal battle, I walked away with enough capital to start my own investment firm. I could have launched a competing tech company. Instead, I chose patience and strategy over immediate vindication. They also didn't know about my private meetings with their biggest clients, who were growing increasingly dissatisfied with Derek's leadership. Like Dr. Elaine Johnson, Chief Innovation Officer at MedCorp Solutions, who had confided in me last month. If Meridian continues on this path, we'll have to reconsider our partnership. Or James Wilson, CTO at Farrington Industries, who had quietly asked if I would consider joining their team because Meridian is wasting your talents. The executives were equally unaware of my late-night calls with board members who had begun to question Derek's reckless expansion strategy. 3 of the 7 directors had expressed concerns about sustainability and corporate culture, especially after the exodus of top talent that followed Derek's promotion to CEO. Rachel, make sure you capture the key growth metrics, Derek instructed me condescendingly. Use bullet points, they're easier to understand. I nodded obediently. Of course, Mr. Palmer. My apparent subservience was the perfect camouflage. While they viewed me as a non-entity, I had been meticulously documenting the company's vulnerabilities, ethical lapses, and strategic missteps. Every time Derek took credit for someone else's work, every instance of questionable accounting practices, every client complaint that got buried, all carefully cataloged, and they certainly didn't know that tomorrow morning, Horizon Capital would acquire the final shares needed to take controlling interest of Meridian Technologies, the company Derek believed was his personal kingdom. My lawyer would finalize the transaction at 9 a.m., precisely 1 hour before the scheduled board meeting where Derek planned to announce his restructuring plan, which I knew included eliminating my position. My phone vibrated silently in my pocket. Away. Text from my second-in-command at Horizon. Final paperwork prepared, sellers confirmed, ready for your signature in the morning. I excused myself to use the restroom, and no one even acknowledged my departure. In the privacy of the executive washroom, I allowed myself a moment to breathe deeply and examine my reflection. The woman in the mirror, with her sensible blouse, minimal makeup, and deliberately understated presence, was a carefully constructed persona. Tomorrow, Rachel Bennett, the overlooked analyst, would give way to R.J. Bennett, CEO and majority shareholder. When I returned to the boardroom, Derek was deep into his self-congratulatory monologue about his visionary leadership. I resumed my note-taking, counting down the hours. 6 more hours of their mockery. 6 more hours of being invisible. Then everything would change. The quarterly review dragged on for another 2 hours. As the executive team transitioned from champagne to bourbon, their comments grew increasingly unfiltered. I remained in my corner, the human equivalent of office furniture, present but unnoticed. My journey at Meridian Technologies had begun 7 years ago with such promise. I'd been personally recruited by Edward Merritt, the company's founder, after he read my research paper on predictive analytics for business consulting. You have exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need, he had told me during our first meeting at a technology conference in Chicago. For the first 4 years, Meridian had lived up to its promise. Under Edward's mentorship, I thrived, developing proprietary analytical models that transformed how the company served its clients. My team grew from just me to 15 analysts. We pioneered a healthcare consulting division that quickly became the company's fastest-growing segment. Then Edward had his stroke. The board, composed largely of Edward's old friends and golf partners, had appointed Derek as interim CEO. He had been Edward's protégé, charismatic, polished, with an MBA from Wharton and the right family connections. The interim title became permanent when Edward reluctantly stepped down after his partial recovery. Within 6 months of Derek's ascension, everything changed. Let's discuss the swift acquisition. Derek's voice pulled me back to the present. He was referring to Swift Technologies, a smaller competitor that specialized in financial services consulting. I fought to keep my expression neutral. The Swift acquisition was another of my recommendations that Derek had initially rejected, only to resurrect it as his own brilliant idea months later. My detailed analysis had shown that Swift's client portfolio perfectly complemented our own, with minimal overlap and maximum synergy potential. This deal will position us as the dominant player in the financial sector, Derek announced, as if revealing this insight for the first time. Mark my words, this time next year, we'll have doubled our market share. Chief Financial Officer Lawrence Simmons, Derek's former fraternity brother, nodded enthusiastically. The numbers look fantastic, Derek. Very bold move. What neither mentioned was that the acquisition price had mysteriously increased by 15% from my original valuation. I had my suspicions about where that additional $12 million would ultimately end up, and I'd been quietly gathering evidence. "Rachel," Derek called out without looking in my direction, "make sure the minutes reflect unanimous executive support for the swift acquisition." I dutifully noted it, though I knew at least 2 executives had expressed reservations privately. Vanessa Liu, our head of marketing, caught my eye briefly before looking away. She had confided her concerns about cultural integration just last week, but remained silent now. Another capable professional cowed by Derek's leadership style. The pattern had been consistent throughout Derek's tenure. Women and minorities were systematically sidelined. Innovative ideas were dismissed unless they came from Derek's inner circle. Critical feedback was treated as disloyalty. The exodus of talent had been steady but significant. 32 high-performing employees had left in the past 18 months, many citing leadership issues in their exit interviews. I had copies of every one of those interviews, courtesy of my only ally in senior management, Diane Jenkins, the retiring VP of Human Resources who had been quietly disturbed by the company's changing culture. Before her departure 3 months ago, she had encrypted and transferred the files to me with a simple note: "For when the time is right." The time was almost here. While Derek continued his monologue about the swift acquisition, my mind drifted to my morning meeting with Edward Merritt. Though partially paralyzed from his stroke, Edward's mind remained sharp. He had invited me to his lakeside home monthly, ostensibly for chess games, but really to discuss the company he still loved. "He's running it into the ground," Edward had said, his speech slightly slurred but his meaning crystal clear. "The innovation is gone. The values are gone. It's becoming a shell of what we built." I had nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "The quarterly numbers look good, though." Edward had made a dismissive gesture with his good hand. "Window dressing. They're burning through the client goodwill we spent 15 years building. Short-term gains, long-term disaster." That conversation had been the final confirmation I needed. With Edward's tacit blessing, I had accelerated Horizon Capital's acquisition plan. And finally, Derek's voice grew louder, pulling me back to the present. The restructuring plan. I felt a chill. This was the part I'd been dreading and preparing for. "We need to streamline operations," Derek continued, taking a deep sip of his bourbon. "Cut the fat. Focus on core competencies." Around the table, a few executives shifted uncomfortably. They knew what was coming. "I've identified several redundancies," Derek said, not bothering to use the euphemism roles instead of people. "We'll eliminate approximately 20 positions next quarter, primarily in analytics and research. We can outsource most of that work for a fraction of the cost. My department, my team, the very people whose analysis had driven Meridian's success. The board will review the final plan tomorrow," Derek concluded, looking pleased with himself. "But I don't anticipate any pushback. The projected savings are too substantial to ignore." Little did he know that tomorrow's board meeting would unfold quite differently than he imagined. As the meeting finally adjourned, Derek stopped me at the door. "Rachel, I'll need a first draft of those minutes on my desk by 8 a.m. tomorrow." "Of course," I replied, my voice professionally pleasant. "Will you be in early tomorrow?" 30, he said dismissively. "I have a breakfast meeting with the board chair to finalize a few details before the 10 a.m. board meeting." He smiled, and for a moment, I glimpsed the predatory nature behind his polished veneer. "Big changes coming. Hope you've updated your resume." I smiled back, the perfect picture of nervous submission. "Always good to be prepared, Mr. Palmer." He seemed disappointed by my lack of visible distress. People like Derek fed on the fear and insecurity of others. My calm acceptance robbed him of that satisfaction. As I gathered my materials, I heard, Him mutter to Lawrence, "Too mousy to even fight for her job. Pathetic." I let the comment wash over me. In less than 24 hours, Derek would understand just how thoroughly he had misjudged me. 7 years of underestimation, of dismissal, of watching my contributions be appropriated by others. All of it had been leading to tomorrow. Back in my modest office, deliberately kept understated to maintain my cover, I closed the door and pulled out my other phone, the one I used exclusively for Horizon Capital business. 3 missed calls from my lawyer and a text message. Seller getting cold feet. Might need to increase offer. Call ASAP. A momentary setback, but nothing that would derail my plans. I had built substantial contingency into both the timing and the budget. The acquisition would proceed, even if it cost a few million more. I dialed my lawyer's number. "Olivia, it's RJ. Increase the offer by 5%, but not a penny more. And make it clear this is final." "Do you think that will be enough?" Olivia asked. She knew how crucial tomorrow's timing was. "It will be," I replied confidently. "Phillips Barnes needs this deal as much as we do. His fund is underwater on 3 other investments and they have redemptions due next month." Olivia chuckled. "You never miss a detail, do you?" "Details are power," I replied, a mantra I'd lived by since watching my father's small business be destroyed by a predatory investor who had exploited a tiny clause in a financing agreement. "I'll see you at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Have everything ready." After hanging up, I turned to preparing the meeting minutes Derek had requested. I would deliver them, perfectly formatted and meticulously accurate, by 7:30 a.m. My final act as Meridian's overlooked analyst. Tomorrow, I would return not as Rachel Bennett, but as RJ Bennett, majority shareholder and new chairperson of Meridian Technologies, and Derek Palmer would finally learn the cost of underestimating me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The security guard nodded as I entered Meridian's building at 6:15 a.m., my usual arrival time. "Morning, Ms. Bennett," he said, barely glancing up from his logbook. Just another unremarkable day with the unremarkable analyst who always arrived early and left late. If he'd looked more closely, he might have noticed subtle differences. My usual plain blouse was replaced by a silk shell beneath my deliberately modest blazer. My sensible flats had given way to designer heels, discreetly hidden under tailored trousers. Small changes, invisible to the casual observer, but the first hints of the transformation to come. I headed to my small office on the 28th floor, 9 floors below the executive suites. The space was intentionally modest, no awards on display, no impressive degrees on the wall, nothing that might draw attention or suggest ambition. For years, this deliberate understatement had been my camouflage. Inside, I placed Derek's meeting minutes on my desk. They would be delivered as promised, but first, I had other matters to attend to. From my drawer, I retrieved a small metal case secured with a biometric lock. Inside was a second phone, a passport in the name RJ Bennett, and several security access cards. I powered on the secure phone and checked my messages. Offer accepted. Paperwork ready for 8 a.m. Congratulations. Olivia's message had arrived at 2:37 a.m. I allowed myself a small smile. The final step was almost complete. Few people knew the full extent of my resources or capabilities. In the 7 years since my intellectual property lawsuit settled for $42 million, I had transformed that settlement into a diversified portfolio worth over $200 million. Horizon Capital Partners managed investments across technology, healthcare, and sustainable energy, with a special focus on companies with strong fundamentals but weak leadership. Meridian Technologies had been in my sights for 3 years, since I recognized the pattern of Derek's leadership. Short-term gains masking long-term vulnerabilities. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya Chen, my operations director at Horizon. Everything in place. Car waiting at 7:30. Legal team assembled. I texted back a simple confirmed and turned to my computer. There was one final piece of preparatory work to complete. Opening a secure virtual desktop that couldn't be traced back to Meridian's systems, I logged into my private database. Over the years, I had compiled meticulous records of Derek's mismanagement, financial discrepancies that bordered on fraud, systematic discrimination in hiring and promotion, client complaints that were buried, and ethical corner-cutting that put the company at risk. Most damning was the evidence around the swift acquisition. The mysterious 15% price increase that I strongly suspected included kickbacks to Derek and Lawrence. 3 months of careful investigation had uncovered offshore accounts and a suspicious consulting agreement with a shell company that led back to Derek's brother-in-law. I wasn't just buying a company, I was preventing its destruction. At 7:25 a.m., I placed the completed meeting minutes in a folder and walked to the executive floor. The receptionist smiled absently as I left the documents on Derek's desk. "He's not in yet," she said unnecessarily. "I know," I replied. "He'll be in at 9:30. She looked momentarily surprised that I would know our CEO's schedule. I had always been invisible, but I saw everything. In the lobby, I nodded to the security guard and exited the building for what would be the last time as Rachel Bennett, Senior Financial Analyst. Outside, a black Tesla waited at the curb. Maya Chen, elegant in a tailored suit, stood beside it. "Ready for this?" she asked as I approached. 7 years ready, I replied. The drive to my penthouse apartment took 15 minutes. The contrast between my deliberate modesty at work and my actual lifestyle would have shocked my colleagues. The 3,200-square-foot space in one of the city's most exclusive buildings offered panoramic views and state-of-the-art security. My actual closet was larger than my office at Meridian, filled with designer clothing I never wore to work. Today's outfit was waiting, a perfectly tailored charcoal suit from a boutique Parisian designer, subtle yet unmistakably powerful. As Maya reviewed final details, I completed my transformation. Hair styled in a more confident arrangement, makeup applied with professional precision, jewelry that spoke of quiet wealth rather than ostentation. The woman in the mirror was still me, but without the camouflage of deliberate understatement. Car. "We'll arrive at Horizon offices at 8:45, Maya confirmed. "Legal team reports all documentation is in order." I nodded, checking my watch. "Time to go." Horizon Capital Partners occupied the top 2 floors of a gleaming tower downtown, its existence, known to the business community but deliberately kept separate from my identity at Meridian. The modern, light-filled offices projected confidence and success, everything I had purposefully hidden in my analyst persona. Olivia Wu, my lead counsel, waited in the conference room with her team and representatives from 3 investment banks. Spread across the table were stacks of documents representing months of complex negotiations. "Congratulations, RJ," Olivia said, using the professional name I'd adopted for my investment career. "You've successfully acquired controlling interest in Meridian Technologies." She slid a document toward me. "This authorizes the final wire transfer of funds." The amount was substantial, nearly $180 million for the 51% stake. But the company was worth far more under proper leadership. I signed without hesitation. 7 years of planning, of being overlooked and underestimated, had led to this moment. "Transfer confirmed," announced the representative from First National Bank several minutes later. "The shares are now registered to Horizon Capital Partners." I turned to Maya. "Initiate Phase 2. She nodded and made a call. Immediately, emails would be sent to all board members requesting their presence at the 10 a.m. meeting. The same meeting Derek had scheduled, but with a significantly different agenda. As I reviewed the documentation confirming my ownership, I thought about what had driven me to this point. It wasn't simple revenge, though I couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing Derek's reaction was hours away. It was something deeper, a commitment to restoring Meridian to what it should be. The company had extraordinary potential. Under Edward's leadership, it had been known for innovation, ethical practices, and employee development. Under Derek, it had become just another profit-driven machine, burning through goodwill and human capital for short-term gain. My phone chimed with an incoming text from Jeremy Powell, one of the board members I'd been cultivating. Just received notice about ownership change. Is this your doing, Rachel? Jeremy had been one of the first to express concerns about Derek's leadership style. 3 months ago, during a discreet dinner, I had hinted at my true capabilities and long-term interest in Meridian. I hadn't revealed the full extent of my plans, but I'd laid the groundwork for his support. Yes. See you at 10, I replied simply. Olivia reviewed my presentation materials one last time. This is comprehensive, she noted, flipping through the evidence of mismanagement I planned to present. He won't be able to counter any of it. He won't have time to try, I replied. The terminations are already prepared. Not just for Derek, but for Lawrence and 2 other executives who had been complicit in the most egregious violations. The others would have a chance to prove themselves under new leadership. At 9:15, Maya and I left Horizon's offices in a company car. The drive to Meridian took 12 minutes through morning traffic. We didn't speak much. Everything had been rehearsed, every contingency planned for. Edward Merritt just arrived, Maya noted, checking her tablet as we pulled up to Meridian's building. That will be a surprise for everyone. I nodded. Edward rarely came to the office since his stroke, but I had visited him yesterday to share my plans. His eyes had lit up with something like hope. Bring back what we built, he'd said, his good hand gripping mine with surprising strength. The lobby security guard did a double-take as I entered, not as the modest analyst he'd greeted 3 hours earlier, but as someone whose presence commanded attention. Maya walked 2 steps behind me, carrying a leather portfolio containing all the documentation we'd need. Good morning, I said to the receptionist, who blinked in momentary confusion. R.J. Bennett for the board meeting. I don't see you. On the visitor list, she stammered, clearly thrown by my transformation. I won't be on the visitor list, I replied calmly. Please inform the board that the new majority shareholder has arrived. Her eyes widened. I should call Mr. Palmer. That won't be necessary, I interrupted smoothly. He'll be joining us shortly. Please direct us to the boardroom. Flustered but unwilling to risk offending someone claiming to be the majority shareholder, she gestured toward the elevator. 38th floor, turn right. As we rode up, Maya glanced at me. Nervous? I considered the question. No, I said truthfully. This isn't about emotions. It's about correction. The boardroom was already half full when we arrived. 6 of the 9 board members had taken their usual seats, with Edward Merritt at the far end, a position of honor, but not authority. They looked up as I entered, confusion evident on most faces. Jeremy Powell was the first to recognize me. Rachel? He asked, disbelief coloring his voice. Or should I say, R.J. Bennett? Edward smiled from his seat, nodding slightly in approval. Good. Morning, gentlemen, I said, taking the seat at the head of the table, Derek's seat. Yes, I'm Rachel Bennett, Senior Financial Analyst at Meridian Technologies. I'm also R.J. Bennett, founder and CEO of Horizon Capital Partners, which as of 8:42 this morning owns a controlling interest in this company. The silence that followed was profound. I could almost see them recalibrating, reassessing years of interactions with the quiet analysts they had barely noticed. Is this some kind of joke? Asked William Foster, one of Derek's strongest supporters on the board. In response, I gestured to Maya, who distributed copies of the ownership documentation to each board member. As you can see, this is entirely legitimate. Horizon Capital. Partners now owns 51% of Meridian Technologies. But how? Asked another board member, flipping through the paperwork with increasing alarm. Carefully, I replied. and legally. Over the past 2 years, Horizon has acquired shares through various channels. The final block was purchased this morning. I opened my portfolio and removed a second set of documents. Now we have a full agenda to cover before Mr. Palmer arrives for what he thinks is his restructuring presentation. Most urgently, we need to address the systematic mismanagement that has undermined this company's long-term viability. The board members exchanged looks of shock and uncertainty. Edward Merritt, however, was smiling openly now. First item? I continued, my voice calm and authoritative. The termination of Derek Palmer as CEO of Meridian Technologies, effective immediately. As I slid the termination documents across the table for signatures, I heard the elevator doors open in the reception area outside. Perfect timing. Derek had arrived for what he thought would be his moment of triumph, unaware that the quiet analyst he had deemed worthless was about to completely reverse their fortunes. The moment of truth had arrived, and I was more than ready. Derek Palmer strode down the hallway toward the boardroom, radiating confidence. His Italian leather shoes tapped a steady rhythm on the marble floor as he mentally rehearsed his restructuring presentation one last time. Lawrence Simmons walked beside him, both men already celebrating the cost-cutting measures that would boost their quarterly bonuses. Should be straightforward, Derek said, adjusting his custom cufflinks. The board always follows my recommendations. Lawrence nodded, especially with the chairman in your corner. Neither man noticed the unusual silence that had fallen over the executive floor, or the way the administrative staff quickly averted their eyes as they passed. The news of the ownership change was spreading through the company like wildfire, but hadn't yet reached the two men most affected by it. Did you see Rachel's face yesterday when you mentioned cuts to analytics? Lawrence chuckled. Like a deer in headlights. Derek smiled. Some people just don't have what it takes. Speaking of which, did you review the final severance numbers? Minimal. Packages, Lawrence confirmed. Most of them should be grateful for anything, given the performance issues we've documented. Performance issues that had been manufactured, of course. I had copies of the original performance reviews before Derek ordered them altered. Just one more piece of evidence in my comprehensive case against his leadership. As they approached the boardroom, Derek frowned at the closed door. They started without us? Inside, I sat calmly at the head of the table, monitoring the board members' reactions as they reviewed the evidence of mismanagement I'd compiled. Edward Merritt was providing additional context, his decades of experience lending weight to my assertions. The swift acquisition price inflation is particularly concerning, Edward was saying, his speech careful but clear. A 15% unexplained increase deserves immediate investigation. William Foster, still struggling to accept the sudden power shift, shook his head. These are serious allegations, Ms. Bennett. Or Ms. Bennett. But Derek has delivered consistent growth for 3 years. At what cost? I asked quietly, sliding another document across the table. This analysis shows client retention dropping by 22%. We're gaining new clients but losing existing ones at an accelerating rate. The growth is unsustainable. Jeremy Powell nodded. I raised this concern last quarter. Derek dismissed it as a temporary anomaly. It's not temporary, I replied. It's systemic. And it's just the beginning of the problems. The boardroom door swung open. Derek entered with Lawrence a step behind, his confident smile freezing as he took in the scene. Edward Merritt present, board members reviewing unfamiliar documents, and most shockingly, me sitting in his chair at the head of the table. For 3 seconds, he didn't recognize me. I watched the confusion in his eyes as he tried to place the confident executive in the designer suit. Then realization dawned, followed immediately by disbelief. Rachel? The shock in his voice was almost comical. What is this? Why are you in my seat? I met his gaze steadily. Good morning, Derek. Please have a seat. We were just discussing your leadership of Meridian Technologies. His eyes darted around the room, looking for allies, explanation, or escape. Finding none, his expression hardened. "This is completely inappropriate." "Whatever stunt you're pulling, this isn't a stunt," I interrupted calmly. "This is a board meeting of Meridian Technologies, called by its new majority shareholder." Derek's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "What are you talking about? There's no new majority shareholder." I gestured to Maya, who handed him a copy of the ownership documentation. As of 8:42 this morning, Horizon Capital Partners owns 51% of Meridian Technologies. As founder and CEO of Horizon, I now control this company. The color drained from Derek's face as he scanned the documents. Lawrence peered over, his shoulder, his expression morphing from confusion to dread. "This can't be legal," Derek sputtered, looking to the board members for support. "This is some kind of fraud." "I assure you, it's entirely legal," I replied. "In fact, I've had 3 independent law firms verify the transaction." Derek's shock was quickly giving way to anger. "You've been planning this? While working for me? That's a conflict of interest. No more of a conflict than you taking kickbacks on the Swift acquisition," I countered, sliding another folder toward him. "Or altering performance reviews to justify terminations, or misrepresenting client satisfaction metrics to the board." Lawrence had begun to edge toward the door, sensing disaster. "I should get the legal team." "Stay, Lawrence," I commanded, my voice leaving no room for debate. "Your financial involvement in these issues requires your presence." Derek's face flushed with rage. "You can't possibly think you can run this company. You're just an analyst." "Am I?" I asked quietly. "Let's review my actual qualifications." I pressed a button on the remote in front of me, and the large screen at the end of the boardroom illuminated with my credentials. MBA from Stanford. Previous executive roles at 2 Fortune 500 companies. The landmark intellectual property case I'd won, and the growth of Horizon Capital's portfolio under my leadership. "I've been running successful companies since you were middle management, Derek," I said, my voice level, despite the satisfaction coursing through me. "The question isn't whether I can run Meridian Technologies. The question is why I allowed someone with your limitations to run it for as long as you did." The board members were watching the exchange with a mixture of astonishment and growing comprehension. Edward Merritt's smile had widened into something approaching delight. Derek tried a different approach. "The board won't support this hostile takeover. Will you, William?" William Foster, who had been Derek's staunchest supporter, glanced down, at the evidence of financial impropriety in front of him, then at Edward Merritt, whose opinion he had always respected. "Actually," William said carefully, "I think we need to take these allegations very seriously." Derek's confident facade cracked. "Further, this is ridiculous. I've delivered record profits by sacrificing long-term stability for short-term gains," I interjected. "By driving away top talent, by compromising ethical standards, by creating a toxic culture that undermines innovation." I turned to the board. "I've provided each of you with a comprehensive analysis of Meridian's current vulnerabilities and my strategic plan to address them. I believe you'll find it aligns with the founding vision that made this company successful." "In the first place," Derek slammed his hand on the table, "you can't just walk in here and take over. I built this company." "You didn't build anything," Edward Merritt said, his voice quiet but commanding attention. "You inherited what others built and began to dismantle it piece by piece." For the first time, Derek seemed to register Edward's presence. His former mentor's condemnation appeared to hit him harder than anything else. "Edward," he began, his tone shifting to one of wounded betrayal. "You can't possibly support this." "I do support it," Edward replied firmly. "Wholeheartedly. Rachel represents everything I hoped Meridian would stand for when I founded it." I could see Derek's mind racing, searching for leverage, for a way to regain control of the situation. His eyes fixed on me with cold calculation. "You think you've won," he said, his voice low. "But this isn't over. My contract has very specific termination clauses. The golden parachute alone will cost you millions." I smiled for the first time since he'd entered the room. "I was hoping you'd mention that." With deliberate slowness, I opened another folder. "Your contract does indeed have impressive protections against termination without cause. Fortunately, we're terminating you with cause." I slid the termination letter across the table. "Breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of company funds, creating a hostile work environment. The documentation is quite extensive." Derek didn't touch the letter. "You can't prove any of that." "Actually, I can prove all of it," I replied, pressing another button on the remote. The screen changed to show a series of damning emails, financial records, and testimonials that I'd gathered over years. "This is just a sample. There's much more." Lawrence had grown increasingly pale as the evidence mounted. "Derek," he whispered urgently. "They have the offshore account details." Derek shot him a venomous look. "Shut up, Lawrence." I turned to the board members, who were watching with growing alarm. "Gentlemen, I believe we need to vote on the immediate termination of Derek Palmer as CEO of Meridian Technologies. Those in favor?" One by one, hands raised around the table. Even William Foster, after a moment's hesitation, joined the unanimous decision. "The board has spoken," I said, pushing the termination letter closer to Derek. "Your employment with Meridian Technologies is terminated, effective immediately." Derek stared at the letter, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. The swagger and confidence that had carried him through life deserted him completely, leaving only a shell of the man who had called me worthless just 24 hours earlier. "You planned this," he said, his voice hollow. "All these years you were just waiting." "I recognized what you were the day you took over," I replied honestly. "But I stayed because I believed in what Meridian could be. What it should be. What it will be again." I gestured to Maya, who had moved to stand by the door. "Security will escort you to clear out your personal belongings. Your company credentials, phone, and laptop are already deactivated." Derek looked around the room one last time, searching for a sympathetic face and finding none. 7 years of arrogance and mistreatment had left him without allies when he needed them most. As security appeared at the door, Derek made one last, desperate attempt. "You won't get away with this. I'll fight it in court. "I sincerely hope you try," I interrupted calmly. "Discovery would be fascinating. I'm sure the SEC would be particularly interested in the documentation we've gathered." The mention of potential SEC involvement silenced him immediately. Even Derek wasn't foolish enough to invite that level of scrutiny. As security led him toward the door, I called after him. "Oh, and Derek? It turns out I am essential to this company after all." His face contorted with rage, but he said nothing as the door closed behind him. I turned back to the board. "Now, let's discuss Lawrence Simmons and the CFO position." Lawrence's face went from pale to ashen. "I can explain the discrepancies." "I'm sure you can," I replied. "But not to this board. Your termination letter is right here." The transformation was complete. In less than 30 minutes, I had gone from the overlooked analyst to the woman who controlled the company's future. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of Meridian's renewal. As Lawrence was escorted out and the remaining board members looked to me for direction, I felt Edward Merritt's approving gaze. This wasn't about revenge, satisfying as Derek's downfall had been. It was about restoration. "Shall we continue with the real business of this company?" I asked, opening the strategic plan I'd spent years developing. "We have a lot of work to do." Word of Derek's dramatic downfall spread through Meridian Technologies like an electrical current. By noon, the entire company was buzzing with the news that the quiet analyst from the 28th floor was now their CEO and majority owner. The story grew more incredible with each retelling. How I had sat silently for years, documenting every misstep, building my case while building my stake in the company. In the executive conference room adjacent to the boardroom, I met with the remaining leadership team. 4 empty chairs stood as stark reminders of the morning's events. Derek, Lawrence, and 2 other executives whose complicity in the most egregious violations had earned them immediate termination. The surviving executives watched me with a mixture of apprehension and calculation, no doubt reviewing their past interactions with the mousy analyst they had routinely ignored or dismissed. Vanessa Liu, the marketing director who had laughed at Derek's jokes yesterday, now sat ramrod straight, her expression carefully neutral. "I want to be the first to congratulate you on your new position," she offered, testing the waters. "Thank you, Vanessa," I replied evenly. "I recall our conversation last week about your concerns regarding the Swift acquisition's cultural integration issues. You were right to be concerned." Her eyes widened slightly, surprised that I would reference a private conversation she thought inconsequential. "I'd like to see a revised integration plan on my desk by Friday," I continued. "One that prioritizes talent retention and cultural alignment rather than short-term cost-cutting." She nodded quickly. "Of course. I've actually been working on an alternative approach that might better preserve the value of both organizations." I suppressed a smile. Vanessa was adaptable, if nothing else. "I look forward to reviewing it." I turned to address the entire group. "Let me be clear about what happens next. This is not just a change in leadership. It's a fundamental reset of how Meridian operates." The tension in the room was palpable. These people had thrived under Derek's regime, even if they hadn't actively participated in his worst excesses. "I've reviewed each of your performance records, management styles, and contributions," I continued. "Some of you have maintained your integrity despite the prevailing culture. Others have compromised in ways that concern me. Several of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. You each have a choice to make. You can embrace the values that will guide Meridian moving forward: innovation, ethical conduct, collaboration, and genuine client service, or you can tender your resignation. There will be no middle ground." Marcus Chen, the head of product development who had been increasingly sidelined under Derek's leadership, was the first to speak up. "What does this mean for the restructuring plan? Are you still cutting the analytics department?" I shook my head. "The restructuring as envisioned by Derek is canceled. In fact, we'll be expanding the analytics team and integrating advanced capabilities across all business units." The relief on Marcus's face was evident. He had fought to protect his research team from Derek's cuts. "However," I added, "we will be conducting a thorough evaluation of all operations. Inefficiencies will be addressed, underperformers will be coached, and if necessary, replaced. But these decisions will be based on merit and contribution, not on who laughs at the CEO's jokes or plays golf with the CFO." That comment landed exactly as intended, drawing uncomfortable glances among the executives who had done precisely that. "I've prepared individual briefs for each of you," I said, as Maya distributed folders around the table. "These outline my expectations, areas of concern, and immediate priorities for your departments. Review them carefully. We'll meet individually tomorrow to discuss." As they opened their folders, I could see the impact of my thoroughness. Each brief contained detailed analyses of their departments, insights into problems they thought hidden, and clear metrics for success moving forward. "One final note," I said, rising to signal the meeting's end. "Effective immediately, all employees terminated under Derek's questionable performance review system are being invited to reapply for their positions. We've lost too much talent to ego and politics." The executives filed out, clutching their folders like lifelines. Only Maya remained behind, a small smile playing at her lips. "That went well," she observed. "The look on Henderson's face when he saw your analysis of his department's turnover rate was priceless," I nodded. "He's been driving out women and minorities while promoting friends from his fraternity." He has 2 weeks to demonstrate a meaningful change in approach, or he'll be joining Derek in the unemployment line. Maya checked her tablet. Speaking of Derek, security reports he's cleared out his office. Made quite a scene, apparently. I expected nothing less, I replied, gathering my materials. What's the status on the company-wide announcement? Email goes out at 1 p.m., followed by the all-hands meeting at 3. Edward Merritt has agreed to introduce you. The symbolism wasn't subtle. The founder literally passing the torch to the new leader, bypassing Derek completely from the company's narrative. It would send a powerful message about the direction Meridian was taking. Perfect. And the analyst team? Maya smiled. They're assembled in conference room C, as requested. They don't know why they've been called in. I checked my watch. Let's not keep them waiting. I made my way down to the 28th floor, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed me. The transformation in how people responded to me was immediate and stark. The same people who had looked through me yesterday now scrambled to open doors and offer greetings. Outside conference room C, I paused to compose myself. This meeting mattered more to me than the confrontation with Derek or the boardroom triumph. These were my people, the ones who had suffered most under Derek's leadership, the ones whose innovations had been stolen, whose contributions had been minimized. Inside, 15 anxious faces turned toward me as I entered. My team of analysts had been told nothing except to attend an urgent meeting, standard procedure when layoffs were imminent. Teresa Johnson, my most talented data scientist, was the first to recognize me despite my transformed appearance. "Rachel?" she asked, confusion evident in her voice. "What's going on? We heard rumors about Derek and some kind of ownership change." I moved to the front of the room. "The rumors are true. As of this morning, I am the majority shareholder and CEO of Meridian Technologies." The shock that rippled through the room was followed by confused murmurs. These people knew me as their department head, the quiet champion who fought for their projects behind the scenes, but often lost to Derek's executive team. "I know this is surprising," I continued. "For years, I've maintained a specific persona within Meridian while building my external investment firm, Horizon Capital Partners. Today, those two worlds converged when Horizon acquired controlling interest in Meridian. David Chen, our youngest analyst who had nearly been terminated last month under Derek's restructuring plan, raised his hand tentatively. "So, we're not being laid off?" The question broke the tension, drawing nervous laughter from the team. "Not only are you not being laid off," I replied with a smile, "but your department is about to become the centerpiece of Meridian's future strategy." The relief in the room was palpable, quickly turning to excitement as I outlined my vision for the analytics team. These were brilliant people who had been constrained by Derek's limited vision and threatened by his insecurity. "For too long, your innovations have been suppressed or appropriated by others," I said. "That ends today. I've seen what each of you is capable of when given the resources and recognition you deserve." Teresa leaned forward. "What about the healthcare initiative? Derek shut it down last quarter even though the preliminary results were promising." "Reinstated with triple the previous budget," I replied. "In fact, I want you to lead it, Teresa. The project proposal you submitted, the one Derek dismissed, will be the foundation of our new healthcare vertical." The transformation in the room was remarkable. People who had arrived expecting termination notices were now eagerly discussing projects they had been forced to abandon, innovations they had kept quiet for fear of rejection. I moved among them, addressing each person by name, referencing their specific contributions and ideas. The message was clear. I had seen them, valued them, even when appearing not to notice. As the meeting concluded, David approached me hesitantly. "Can I ask, why did you stay? All these years, if you had the resources to do anything else. Why? Put up with Derek's treatment?" It was the question at the heart of everything, one I had asked myself during particularly difficult periods. "Because Meridian matters," I answered honestly. "The work we do here, when done right, improves businesses and lives, and because sometimes the most effective position isn't the most visible one. I looked around at my team, people whose talents had been systematically undervalued. Sometimes you have to be patient, observe carefully, and wait for exactly the right moment to act. David nodded thoughtfully. Like a chess player. Exactly like a chess player, I agreed. And today was checkmate. As I left the conference room, my phone buzzed with a message from Maya. Derek just gave an interview to Business Insider, claiming wrongful termination and threatening legal action. I smiled slightly. Derek's predictable response would only strengthen our position when the full evidence became public. My next stop was the 37th floor, Derek's former executive suite, now mine. The contrast between this space and my modest office 9 floors below was stark. Where my office had been functional and plain, Derek's was an ostentatious display of power and privilege. I studied the space that would now be mine, noting the expensive art that would be returned to the company collection, the bar cart that would be removed, the intimidating desk arrangement that created unnecessary distance between Derek and anyone entering his office. All of it would change. The physical transformation of this space would mirror the cultural transformation of Meridian itself, from a hierarchy built on intimidation to an ecosystem built on collaboration and merit. Maya joined me, tablet in hand. Facilities is ready. To begin renovations whenever you approve the plans. And Edward Merritt is here for the all-hands meeting. I nodded, taking one last look at the trappings of Derek's failed leadership. Let's go make this official. The company auditorium was filled beyond capacity, with employees standing along the walls and crowding the doorways. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of confusion, excitement, and uncertainty. Edward Merritt stood at the podium, his physical presence still commanding despite his partial paralysis. As I walked onto the stage to join him, a hush fell over the crowd. Many were seeing me, really seeing me for the first time. Most of you know me as the founder of Meridian Technologies, Edward began, his voice strong despite his slightly slurred speech. Some of you have only heard of me since my retirement. Today, I return to introduce the new leader of this company, a leader who embodies the vision and values that Meridian was built upon. He turned to me, genuine respect in his eyes. Rachel Bennett has worked among you for 7 years, observing, learning, and planning for this day. She has seen the best and worst of this company. And now, as both CEO and majority shareholder, she has the power to restore what has been lost. As I stepped to the podium, I could feel hundreds of eyes evaluating me, recalibrating everything. They thought they knew about the quiet analyst from the 28th floor. Thank you, Edward, I began. As most of you have heard by now, this morning marked a significant transition for Meridian Technologies. The reversal was complete. The ignored had become the leader. The underestimated had become the power broker. The observer had become the architect of transformation. Derek's parting words echoed in my mind, "You won't get away with this." But I already had. 3 days after what employees had already begun calling the reversal, I sat in my newly redesigned office reviewing the fallout. The executive suite had been transformed, walls removed to create an open, collaborative environment, the imposing desk replaced with a more approachable workspace, and Derek's expensive but meaningless status symbols replaced with showcases of Meridian's most innovative projects. Maya entered with her tablet, ready for our morning briefing. "You've made quite an impression," she said, nodding toward the stack of business publications on my desk. The headlines told the story. Undercover boss, analyst buys company, fires CEO. The 180 million revenge, how one woman turned the tables, and my personal favorite, worthless to priceless, the Rachel Bennett's story. The media loves a dramatic narrative, I observed. What's the internal response? Overwhelmingly positive, Maya reported. Employee surveys show a 62% increase in optimism about Meridian's future. The analytics team is practically walking on air, and 3 former employees have already accepted offers to return. I nodded, satisfied but not surprised. And our departed executives? Maya's smile turned slightly wicked. That's the most interesting part. Would you like the updates? Chronologically? Or ranked by desperation level? Dealer's choice. She swiped through her tablet. Let's start with Derek. As predicted, his initial bravado has given way to panic. His interview with Business Insider backfired spectacularly when they followed up with us, and we provided documentation of his mismanagement. They're now running an exposé on toxic leadership instead of his wrongful termination claims. I had anticipated this. Derek's instinct would always be to attack rather than reflect, a quality that had served him well in climbing the corporate ladder, but would prove disastrous in his fall. His attorney contacted us this morning, Maya continued. They're suddenly interested in a confidential settlement discussion. I'm sure they are, I replied. Now that the SEC has opened a preliminary inquiry into the Swift acquisition irregularities. That had been another predictable development. The evidence I'd gathered on the inflated acquisition price and the suspicious consulting contract with Derek's brother-in-law had been too compelling to ignore once brought to the right authorities. Lawrence Simmons is singing like a Broadway star, Maya added. His attorney has approached the SEC with an offer to provide complete testimony against Derek in exchange for leniency. I wasn't surprised. Lawrence had always been a follower, not a leader. His loyalty to Derek had extended only as far as it benefited him personally. What about the others? I asked, referring to the 2 additional executives who had been terminated, alongside Derek and Lawrence. Thomas Reed has already accepted a position with a smaller firm, at half his previous salary, Maya reported. He's keeping his head down, hoping to avoid being named in any SEC proceedings. And Gregory Phillips? That's the most interesting case, Maya said, pulling up a specific report. He appeared at HR yesterday, requesting a meeting with you. According to him, he has information about other irregularities that weren't covered in our investigation. I considered this development. Gregory had been Derek's head of business development, involved in several questionable deals, but always maintaining plausible deniability. His attempt to provide additional information suggested he was trying to position himself as a whistleblower, rather than a co-conspirator. Schedule him for tomorrow, I decided. With legal present. Let's see what he's offering. Maya made the note. There's one more update you'll find interesting. Derek's wife has filed for divorce. I raised an eyebrow. That was fast. Apparently, she's retained Patricia Morrison. That explained it. Patricia Morrison was the city's most aggressive divorce attorney, known for her ruthless approach to high-net-worth separations. Derek's wife had wasted no time securing the best representation to protect her interests. The timing suggests she may have had concerns about Derek's activities before his termination, Maya observed. Her filing specifically references potential legal liabilities that could impact marital assets. I nodded thoughtfully. Samantha Palmer, Derek's wife of 12 years, had a background in securities law before becoming a full-time philanthropist. She would understand exactly what the SEC inquiry could mean for their financial future. Derek is experiencing the consequences of his actions on multiple fronts, I noted. Professional, legal, and personal. Karma can be quite thorough, Maya agreed. I turned my attention to the next item on our agenda. What about the client response? Better than projected, Maya reported, switching to a different report. We've had direct contact with our top 20 clients. 18 have expressed relief at the leadership change, particularly after learning about the ethical concerns. The Thompson account, which was on the verge of leaving, has not only committed to staying, but is increasing their engagement by 30%. This was perhaps the most gratifying news. Derek's approach had been burning through the client goodwill that Edward Merritt had spent years building. Restoring those relationships was a top priority. Dr. Elaine Johnson at MedCorp Solutions specifically mentioned that your healthcare analytics initiative was a deciding factor in their expanded commitment, Maya added. She said, and I quote, "It's refreshing to work with a company that values innovation over ego." I smiled at the veiled reference to Derek's leadership style. Dr. Johnson had been on the receiving end of his condescension more than once during client meetings. "And what about the board?" I asked. "Fully aligned with your strategy," Maya confirmed. "Even William Foster has come around after seeing the client response and employee engagement metrics. Edward Merritt has been particularly effective in bringing the more hesitant members on board." The board's support was crucial for the next phase of my plan. While I had the controlling interest to make unilateral decisions, I preferred to build consensus and maintain strong governance practices. A knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Olivia Wu, my legal counsel, entered with a serious expression. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I thought you should know immediately. The SEC has escalated their inquiry into a formal investigation. They've issued subpoenas for all documents related to the Swift acquisition. This was moving faster than even I had anticipated. Are we prepared?" Olivia nodded. "We've preserved all relevant documentation. Our cooperation will be complete and immediate. And the potential impact on Meridian? Minimal," she assured me. "Your documentation clearly shows that the irregularities were confined to Derek, Lawrence, and possibly Gregory. The company itself shouldn't face significant liability, especially given the proactive approach you've taken since assuming control." I turned to Maya. "Prepare a statement for employees and clients. Complete transparency about the investigation, emphasizing our full cooperation and commitment to ethical business practices." As Olivia left to coordinate with the legal team, Maya made another note. "There's one more item you should be aware of. Derek has been approaching current employees, trying to gather information and potentially recruit allies." I wasn't surprised. "Who specifically?" "Primarily from the executive team, those who were most loyal to him. Henderson from operations, Whitman from sales." "Have any responded positively?" Maya shook her head. "No. In fact, both reported the contact immediately as per our updated ethics policy." That was a positive sign. The culture was already shifting away from the secrecy and factionalism that had characterized Derek's leadership. "Keep monitoring the situation," I instructed, "and schedule individual meetings with both Henderson and Whitman. Their reporting deserves recognition." As Maya left to implement these directives, I turned to the window, contemplating how thoroughly the tables had turned. A week ago, Derek had publicly humiliated me, confident in his untouchable position. Now he was desperately reaching out to former colleagues who were promptly reporting his contacts. My phone buzzed with a text from Edward Merritt. "Lunch today? Much to celebrate." I smiled and confirmed. Edward's support had been unwavering since I shared my plans with him. His visible endorsement had been crucial in solidifying my credibility with employees who had never seen me as anything but the quiet analyst. Before heading to my next meeting, I reviewed the latest intelligence on Derek's activities. Since his termination, he had attempted to access company systems using his deactivated credentials, blocked, called 5 board members, none had returned his calls, approached 3 major clients, all had reported the contact to us, listed his penthouse apartment for sale, likely preparing for significant legal expenses, been asked to resign from 2 prestigious club memberships, the stigma of the SEC investigation already taking effect. His world was unraveling with remarkable speed. The man who had built his career on appearances and connections was discovering how quickly both could disappear when the foundation crumbled. My assistant notified me that the executive team was assembled for our strategy meeting. As I gathered, My materials, I reflected on the justice being served, not through my direct action, but through the natural consequences of Derek's own choices. I hadn't needed to destroy Derek Palmer. His own actions, once exposed to light, were accomplishing that quite effectively. In the conference room, the remaining executives waited attentively. The dynamic had shifted dramatically from our first meeting 3 days ago. The initial wariness had given way to cautious engagement as they witnessed the positive response from employees and clients. "Good morning," I began. "Today we're focusing on the rebuilding phase of our strategy. But first, I want to address the SEC investigation that was announced this morning." I outlined the situation clearly, emphasizing that the investigation was focused on specific individuals and transactions, not on the company as a whole. Our path forward is simple: complete transparency, full cooperation, and a commitment to ensuring such ethical breaches cannot happen again. Vanessa Liu, who had adapted most quickly to the new reality, spoke up. "How can we help reassure our teams? Some are concerned about potential fallout." "A valid concern," I acknowledged. "Which is why each of you will meet with your departments today to address questions directly. Maya has prepared talking points that stick strictly to confirmed facts. No speculation, no disparagement of former executives, just clarity about our commitment to ethical practices moving forward." The executives nodded, several making notes. "Now, to our main agenda," I continued. "The renewal of Meridian's innovative culture." As we delved into the strategic plan I'd developed over years of careful observation, I couldn't help but reflect on the dramatic reversal of fortune that had occurred. The executives now eagerly engaging with my vision were the same people who had barely acknowledged my presence in meetings just days earlier. Marcus Chen, whose product development team had been consistently undermined by Derek, was particularly animated. This approach aligns perfectly with what we've been trying to accomplish for years. The integration of analytics across all product lines will significantly enhance our competitive position. "Exactly," I agreed. "Which is why we're reallocating resources from executive compensation packages to R&D. That announcement drew surprised looks. Under Derek's leadership, executive bonuses had grown while research budgets shrank. Effective immediately, the executive bonus structure will be tied directly to innovation metrics, employee retention, and client satisfaction, not just quarterly financial performance." Henderson from operations, one of Derek's former allies, shifted uncomfortably. "That's quite a departure from current incentives." "It is," I confirmed. "Because the current incentives produced exactly the behavior we're now addressing with the SEC." The message was clear. The rules had changed, and those unwilling to adapt should consider their options. As the meeting progressed, I observed each executive carefully, noting who was embracing the new direction and who was merely going through the motions. The transformation of Meridian wouldn't happen overnight, and not everyone would make the journey successfully. But with each passing day, Derek's influence diminished further, replaced by a culture of accountability, innovation, and genuine collaboration. The justice wasn't just in his personal downfall, but in the restoration of what Meridian should have been all along. The tables had completely turned. The man who had called me worthless was now watching his career, reputation, and personal life disintegrate while I rebuilt the company he had nearly destroyed. Sometimes justice arrives not as a sudden strike, but as the inevitable consequence of one's own actions finally coming to light. 6 months after the reversal, I stood at the podium in Meridian's renovated auditorium, preparing to address the entire company at our quarterly all-hands meeting. The room had transformed along with the company, brighter, more open, with collaboration spaces replacing the rigid row seating Derek had preferred. "When I look around this room," I began, "I see the real value of Meridian Technologies, not in our balance sheet, impressive as it has become, not in our client list, distinguished as it is, but in the collective talent, creativity, and commitment. Of everyone here, the faces looking back at me reflected a transformed company culture. People who had been marginalized under Derek's leadership now led key initiatives. Departments that had been siloed now collaborated regularly. The fear-based hierarchy had given way to a merit-driven ecosystem. 6 months ago, I promised a return to the foundational values that made Meridian great. Today, I'm proud to announce we've not only restored those values, we've exceeded our original vision. On the large screen behind me, the quarterly results appeared. Not just financial metrics, but comprehensive measurements of client satisfaction, employee engagement, innovation output, and ethical business practices. Revenue up 24% year-over-year. Client retention improved from 68% to 94%. Employee turnover reduced from 22% to just 7%. And 18 new patents filed this quarter alone. The applause was genuine and enthusiastic. These weren't just abstract numbers. They represented the collective achievement of people who had been liberated to do their best work. These results affirm what I've always believed, that success comes not from the loudest voice in the room, but from creating an environment where every voice is heard and valued. From my position on stage, I could see Teresa Johnson, now Vice President of Healthcare Analytics, sitting beside David Chen, whose innovative approach to predictive modeling had earned him a rapid promotion to director. In the back row stood Edward Merritt, his pride evident even from a distance. Before we conclude, I want to address the question many of you have asked in recent weeks about the settlement of legal proceedings against former executives. The room quieted. The SEC investigation had expanded significantly since its initial focus on the Swift acquisition, revealing a pattern of ethical breaches that had threatened Meridian's very foundation. This morning, the SEC announced that Derek Palmer and Lawrence Simmons have agreed to a settlement that includes financial penalties, disgorgement of improperly obtained compensation, and a ban from serving as officers or directors of any public company for 10 years. There was no applause at this news, just thoughtful nods. We had moved beyond celebrating the downfall of former leaders to focusing on our collective future. This chapter of Meridian's history is now closed. The legal matters are resolved, the governance improvements are in place. Our path forward is clear and unburdened by past misdeeds. As the meeting concluded and employees filtered out, many stopped to share quick updates on projects or simply to express their appreciation for the company's transformation. The most meaningful comment came from an engineer who had nearly been terminated under Derek's restructuring plan. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to dread coming to work. Now I have trouble leaving at the end of the day because I'm so engaged with what we're building." That simple statement validated everything. The years of patience, the careful planning, the strategic acquisition, all of it worthwhile to restore Meridian to what it should have been all along. Later that afternoon, I sat with Edward Merritt, in my office, reviewing plans for Meridian's future expansion. "You've accomplished more in 6 months than I thought possible," Edward said, his speech much improved with ongoing therapy. "The company feels like Meridian again, but better." "I had an excellent foundation to build upon," I replied. "Your vision was always the right one." Edward shook his head. "My vision wouldn't have mattered without someone to reclaim it. I made a catastrophic error in judgment with Derek." "We all make mistakes," I said. "The difference is learning from them." "Speaking of Derek," Edward said, glancing at the business journal on my desk. "Have you seen the latest?" I nodded. The article detailed Derek's rapid descent, from the divorce settlement that had claimed half his assets to the SEC penalties that had taken most of what remained. His attempt to start a consulting practice had failed when potential clients discovered his regulatory history. The final indignity was his recent listing as an adjunct professor at a third-tier business school, teaching a class on corporate governance of all things. "Poetic justice," Edward observed. "I take no pleasure in his downfall," I said truthfully. The goal was never to destroy Derek. It was to save Meridian. Edward studied me thoughtfully. You could have exposed him years ago. Why wait? Why endure all that disrespect? It was a question I'd reflected on many times. Because timing matters. Acting too soon, with insufficient leverage or evidence, would have risked everything. And because there was value in the experience, in being underestimated, in observing from a position others dismissed. The quiet analyst seeing everything, Edward mused. You know, in chess, the most powerful piece is often not deployed until the right moment. The queen, I nodded, hidden in plain sight until the perfect time to act. As Edward left, Maya entered with our final agenda item for the day, the review of Meridian's new mentorship program, designed to identify and develop overlooked talent within the company. The pilot group is selected, Maya reported. 20 employees from across all departments, each with high potential that was previously unrecognized. I reviewed the list, noting the diversity of backgrounds, perspectives, and approaches. This program represented everything Derek had failed to value: the power of different viewpoints, the innovation that emerges from inclusion, the strength that comes from genuine meritocracy. Perfect, I approved. This is exactly the future we're building. As the workday ended and employees headed home, I took a moment to stand by the window overlooking the city. 6 months ago, I had been the invisible analyst, systematically underestimated by everyone around me. Today, I led a thriving company that was becoming a model for ethical leadership and innovative culture. The lesson wasn't just about patience or strategic thinking, though both had been essential. It was about the fundamental truth that power doesn't always announce itself, that strength isn't always measured in volume or aggression, that sometimes the most formidable person in the room is the one quietly taking notes in the corner. Derek had called me worthless because he could only recognize value that mirrored his own approach. His narrow vision had been his undoing, while my broader perspective had become Meridian's salvation. As I turned to leave, my eye caught a small, framed quote on my desk, words I had chosen to mark my official transition to CEO. The most powerful person in the room is not always the loudest. Sometimes it's the one with the patience to listen, the wisdom to observe, and the courage to act at exactly the right moment. The company I had rescued was now flourishing beyond even my ambitious projections. The people who had been silenced were now leading innovations, and the analyst once dismissed as worthless had revealed her true value, not just to herself, but to everyone who had failed to see it. Sometimes the most satisfying victory isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right.